Nigeria's impending tax reform, scheduled to take effect in January 2026, have sparked widespread public anxiety, but the chairman of the Presidential Committee on Fiscal Policy and Tax Reforms, Taiwo Oyedele, insists the changes are being misunderstood. Speaking at the 2025 Nigeria Media Merit Awards in Lagos, Oyedele said the reforms are not aimed at imposing heavier tax burdens on citizens, but at rebuilding trust in Nigeria's tax system. He stressed that fairness, transparency, and accountability rather than aggressive revenue targets are the core goals of the Nigeria Tax Act 2025. Kenneth Erikume, partner, tax reporting and strategy at PwC, joins me now. Thank you for your time this morning.
Anna, for having me.
Yes, and I mean, let's begin with the current controversy around the Tax Reform Act, right? We know that there are some controversies now with the gazetted copy, and so, there being some sort of difference between what was brought to the National Assembly and what was gazetted. Walk us through that, and what are the facts around this?
All right, so it's difficult to actually be, it's difficult to unpack the facts without visibility of why there are differences or if there are differences. But, what I can unpack is actually the process, right? Because after the third reading of the bill, it's supposed to go back to the Senate and the House of Reps for them to consider the bill and come up with recommendations. Now, this process occurs separately in each of the chambers, which means that both chambers may actually come out with different outcomes. Now, when there are differences, the chambers will constitute a joint committee to sit down and look at those differences. Now, when they have considered those differences, that joint committee will then make a recommendation to the two chambers, which will then mean that the bill can then begin to go for adoption. Now, where there's no disagreement, it goes to, it goes back to the two houses. And then, essentially, where there's an agreement, they would adopt the committee's recommendation and pass those bills. Now, when it gets to that stage, a final clean copy is then sent to the clerk of the National Assembly to present to the president for it to be, passed into law. So that's essentially the process. Now, if there's a difference between that harmonized version and the final signed into law by the president, then obviously some legal considerations would have to come into play around whether that version that is gazetted, if it differs, can actually be law. Now, if there are differences, my expectation is that those differences have to be isolated and should not necessarily, put everything back, because a lot has gone into this, lots of debate, a lot of effort and resources. So just, pulling the plug on the full thing, doesn't really augur well from a national perspective. Mm-hmm. So my expectation is that, if I were, being considered for a recommendation for things to proceed as is, and clear isolation of areas of differences so that those can be tackled subsequently. Mm. But I agree with you that, it's caused a lot of controversy and a lot of uproar in the public, and there seems to be no clarity from a lot of taxpayers on whether the laws will be coming into force on the 1st of January or whether there is no law. Mm. But these things we have to leave to the politicians, the legislative arm and the executive arm, for things to be tidied up, and a communication needs to come to the public.
Yeah, indeed. We did have Taiwo Oyedele speak to media and say that what was circulating online was a fake, copy. And we know that lawmakers, they claim the tax law was altered. There's a 7-member committee that has been set up to investigate these allegations. Looking at the time frame, we're less than 2 weeks till January 1st. Set date for implementation. I know you have expressed your wishes that things should go on and those particular segments that they believe have been altered should be addressed separately. But realistically speaking, less than 2 weeks to January 1st, set implementation date. Do you see us going ahead and it going into full implementation 1st of next year?
I believe so, honestly. And anything contrary will send the wrong signal. It will send the wrong signal to the international community as well as investors that, we're not keeping our house in order, right? Because essentially there has been a lot of focus around these tax reforms. By the way, these tax reforms have been long overdue because of the outcomes of our tax system. When you look at the results, a tax to GDP ratio way below the expectation of a country like Nigeria, something had to be done. And there's been a lot of focus and attention from different stakeholders and interest as well. And if you remember, looking at, for example, the petroleum industry bill and how long it took and the impact it had on investments and investors. And, we began to lose some of the investments we could have had into the oil and gas space to neighboring countries and other African regions, just because of that uncertainty. And for me, that is a significant issue if the law is not implemented effective 1st of January. Some transitions have already started to happen. The Federal Inland Revenue Service is already on its way to become the Nigeria Revenue Service. The Joint Tax Board has already announced and unveiled, on a small scale, its new logo as the Joint Revenue Board. The Tax Ombudsman was appointed by the president and cleared. So a lot of things have already started happening because remember, it's not just the taxation provisions. There's also the administrative provisions, which are already in full motion and are already being implemented. So I don't think we can pull the plug in mid-flight because the consequences would be quite dire and overwhelming. I think, all the critical stakeholders driving this, from the chairman of the Presidential Committee on Fiscal Reforms and Tax Policy to the Minister of Finance, as well as the president, as well as the legislative arm, everybody needs to come together to ensure that this thing happens 1st of January. Now, if you roll things back, remember, people have already done budgets. People have, when I'm talking about people, I'm not talking about the government, but I'm talking about the private sector, critical private sector.
All right, hopefully we're able to get our guest back up. But yes, pulling the plug mid-flight, he said, definitely a major risk. But we know that there have been talks of suspension even before this current controversy. There have been those within the House, within the National Assembly, who have been pushing for the suspension of this tax act, right?
Have already done budgets based on the estimation changes in their investment structure as mice.
Yeah. Mr. Erikume, it seems we lost you for a second there. I don't know if you're still with us. Hopefully we are able to... Back. All right, great. So the last thing I had, I'll be honest with you, is, pulling the plug mid-flight, the risk companies have already budgeted for 2026 aligned with this new tax law and the risk involved in it being suspended. And I think we're going to move on a bit. Talks of suspension have been, on the table from governorship levels to even the National Assembly itself. Even before this current controversy, you have highlighted the risk for international communities' perception, private sector as well. Let's come to revenue, Nigeria's revenue. We know one of the aims of this reform was to raise revenue, whether the government wants to, shy away from that or being directed, but we know that raising revenue is one of the key aims of this tax act. So let us into the impact this will have on revenue, especially considering what happened this year with the shortfall we had.
Yeah, very good question. Actually, there would always be an impact on the tax law on revenue. So even if broadly that may not be the intention to say, well, we are going to increase rates and increase the burden on citizens, but at the end of the day, government is going through these reforms to effectively ensure that we improve the tax to GDP ratio. And how are they going to do that? There's a lot of measures, especially from an administrative perspective, to streamline tax administration and make it more efficient. Some of the things the innovation they've brought into the law include things around transparency. One of the big problems big problem with Nigeria today is lack of effective data, lack of transparency around transactions to be able to administer taxes effectively. And a lot of innovation have been brought into this tax reform act to ensure that those things are actually addressed. From returns that banks have to submit periodically on transactions happening in the banking system, to ensuring that, at the subnational level, the focus on payee shifts a bit more to direct assessment, including high net worth individuals and sole proprietors, to all other areas. So already government would have been planning with that at the back of their minds, understanding that there would be an improvement in tax revenue. And that would be the sort of, assumptions driving the revenue projections in the budget. Now, if you change mid-course and you suspend everything and say, well, let's go back to the status quo, those assumptions would then be wrong. And you will, effectively not be able to hit the mark in terms of the expectations. So government would have to roll back, the assumptions made in that budget and look at that budget and say, what is in there in terms of the revenue projections, which, has been based on the new law, but we now have to go back to the old law. And that just creates a lot of complications. So in my mind, the impact, and I'm not even sure why this is, something that everyone is debating, because for me, my view is very clear that things have to proceed as is. Otherwise, the implications are far-reaching, not just in the private sector, but like you alluded to, even in the public sector and in government, where projections have been made in that regard.
Indeed. But let's come to the Nigerian people, right? A lot of them who are looking at what's happening now are just like, well, let's just put this thing on hold. Or are we really ready for this? And given the widespread fears, the misinformation around it, what would you say we're ready? And what would be your message to the people who may have those fears and may be confused by the misinformation and may be at the point of, let's just suspend this thing?
I think people want to become tax experts overnight. That's really the interesting thing here, because I've been in forums and people are talking about these tax reforms, and very few people have actually read it. That's the reality, because it's a difficult act to read. I've read it because I'm a tax professional. That's what I do for a living. So it's essentially like debating, well, I wouldn't exactly say that tax as a profession is rocket science, but essentially everyone having a view with regards to something that is quite complicated. There are many positives in this law or these laws that have been overlooked. For example, the improvements in the margins of businesses will be significant because of the ability to claim VAT on costs.